All Souls Unitarian Universalist Church, building community, inspiring growth, creating change. Here in the heart of Kansas City, we come together to create this hour of shared reflection so that we might be renewed in courage for these times and inspired to lives of greater dignity, higher purpose, deeper generosity, and more effective action. If you are new to Unitarian Universalism or to our congregation, we want to get to know you and share part of your journey. If this place is already your spiritual home, welcome once more. We need one another, and it is good to be together again. Because we care for one another's safety, our congregation is gathering online during this long season of coronavirus pandemic. Nevertheless, through the gifts of technology, we continue to celebrate community and connections as we lean into the values of justice, compassion, and reason. Together, we learn the love that has the power to overcome both loneliness in the heart and oppression in the world. Welcome to our service this morning. May the words and music and images that we offer today nourish our best selves, calling forth abundant wisdom and love.
Arise, O souls,
Good morning and welcome on this Memorial Day weekend here at All Souls Unitarian Universalist Church of Kansas City. There are those who say that one of the most important functions of religious community is anamnesis, the practice of not forgetting, of holding in our collective memories those facts of human history that it might be more comfortable for us all to let slip into oblivion and forget. This is why we gather in a covenant community of both memory and promise. We refuse to erase the truth of the past, what we have been capable of, both the nobility, heroism, and resilience of the human spirit at its best, and the arrogance, deceit, and cruelty of our nature at its worst. Each of these recollections can feel like a reproach to our own indifference and indolence, to an ideal to which we may never measure up, or to a shame that we may never repair and overcome. Faith invites us to live in the tension between these realities, seeking the good rather than the perfect, and healing rather than exoneration. On this day of national remembrance, we acknowledge two realities of our shared history. For one, we recall that the first Memorial Day was celebrated by former slaves on May 1st, 1865 in Charleston, South Carolina. They took over the grounds of a former Confederate prison camp where 257 Union soldiers had died and been buried in a mass grave. They dug up those bodies and worked for 2 weeks to give them proper burials as gratitude for having fought for the freedom of enslaved people. Then they held a parade of 10,000 people led by 2,800 Black children, where they marched and sang, celebrated their freedom, and honored the memory of those who had suffered and perished in the struggle for it. Soon, the widows and bereaved mothers of both Union and Confederate soldiers would begin cooperating on this day to mark and tend and honor the graves of the fallen, more united in their sorrow than divided by their politics. Memorial Day invites us to recognize courage and sacrifice, to honor grief, and to confront once more the tragic waste of war, so that we might not be tempted again by its toxic call to glory. An amnesis, my friends, lest we forget. Also on this day, we come to the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre, in which as many as 300 Black residents of a neighborhood called the Greenwood District, also known as Little Africa or Black Wall Street, were murdered by a white mob. 35 square blocks of the most prosperous Black community in the nation were destroyed, along with 1,200 homes, as well as churches, hospitals, schools, and businesses looted and burned, and 8,000 people left homeless. This is one of those memories that it would be more comfortable to allow to slip into historical obscurity and public oblivion. However, as I shall recount to you in a few moments, we as Unitarian Universalists have a particular responsibility to ensure that this does not happen. On the centenary eve of that traumatic event, we must practice an amnesis if our congregations are to have any historical integrity, lest we forget what we are capable of. We kindle our chalice this morning in memory. So that we might be reminded of all that makes us human, the grief of loss, the ideals of honor, the price of freedom, as well as the lust for power, destruction, and greed. May the heartbreak of the past be embraced within our communities and move us to the eternal work of justice and reconciliation. May the hope of harm that might yet be healed and right relations that might yet be made real give us courage to go forward with open eyes and true humility, seeking a future of wholeness and the common good. Now let's join together in speaking once again our covenant promises to this community. Together we affirm, goodwill is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another.
That wash us round about, the clouds that cover us, the rains that fall. Our world is one world, the thoughts we think affect us all, the way we build our attitudes with love or hate we make, a bridge or wall. Our world is one world, its ways of wealth affect us all, the way we spend, the way we share, who are the rich or poor, who stand or fall. Our world is one world, just like a ship that bears us all, where fear and greed make many holes, but where our hearts can hear a different call.
When you start to put the pieces and the timeline together, it just doesn't make sense. The National Guard, the Tulsa Police Department, who deputized around 200 people, the governor declared martial law. You could not do this and not have it be a timed, coordinated effort. The planes from Curtis Southwest Airfield were dispatched at 6 a.m. The National Guard arrived in Tulsa around 9 a.m. The people who burned and looted these houses and businesses, they were assigned that job. That was their mission, was to loot these houses and set fires. The job of the planes were to drop these turpentine balls.
Accelerant.
To accelerate the flame. The job of the National Guard was to evacuate. They had a specific mission to evacuate the residents of Greenwood to 3 concentration camps after the massacre, when Greenwood was trying to recover. The city commission came out with a plan within a week. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to build a new train depot. We're going to make all this commercial land, and we're going to move the Black community further to the north. How do you put together a master plan in a week? The city can't fill a pothole in a week.
Yeah, how do you organize 3 concentration camps, airplanes, all of these things to happen, getting everybody out of Greenwood and all those blocks of homes and businesses burned down in a 16-hour period without some coordination, without some pre-planning? It begs the question. Gerald, I know you've talked about this for a long time.
After the Tulsa Race Riot Commission report was issued, some of us, including All Souls and Church of the Restoration, helped form the Tulsa Reparations Coalition. And that coalition brought in people who would make sure the recommendations were followed, right? Mrs. Jackson was a little girl in 1921, and she told the story, and my ears heard them, that her mother was a domestic worker, and her mother took her to their employer's home because the employer said, there's going to be trouble on Greenwood tomorrow, so you all stay with us. Now, that story was duplicated over and over again by those who remembered. So there were Black people who knew that there was a plan. It wasn't, of course, spread throughout the whole community, but there were some Black people who were sheltered because they knew it was a plan to destroy the business district of Greenwood and loot homes along that avenue. There's more to this than just saying irate white people were so intoxicated with liquor and greed and hatred that they wreaked havoc upon the people of Greenwood. No, it wasn't just that. It was a plan to take the land. And that's the part that people are missing. The Chamber of Commerce has come up with minutes talking about the result of this massacre and how they wanted to put a railroad depot right there at Archer and Greenwood.
Yeah.
And that is part of the history that is circulated orally, but it's not written down.
Well,
Except
right. And
until.
For me, what's so important about what both of you are saying is this wasn't an act of individual prejudice. This was an act of systemic use of power to move a community, to take over the land, and ultimately involved killing and mass destruction. Because when you talk about it as an individual acts of prejudice that maybe morphed into mob violence, it doesn't sound like there's any real culpability or responsibility of people in power who could actually right the wrong. And in my understanding, especially as I read your book and other histories that are starting to come out, it seems a lot clearer when you deputize 200 people that go in now under the auspices of the state, the government, the city's auspices, and they do this destruction. Well, the city pays claims on when a deputy officer or a police officer or anyone else kills somebody, harms somebody, uses their power and force in a way that's destructive. The city pays. The city never paid. Nobody paid back the folks whose land and property and loved ones were destroyed.
Good morning, All Souls. I'm Angela Allard, a member of All Souls and a member of the board for More Squared, the Metropolitan Organization for Racial Economic Equity. Our church was a founding member of More Squared, and as part of All Souls, each one of you are members of More Squared also, and welcome to participate in our work. The offering today will be dedicated to and shared with More Squared. And today's date was chosen because it is the 100th anniversary of the burning of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Events of this past year surrounding the killing of George Floyd, the growth of the Black Lives Matter movement, and all of the killings of people of color by the police have brought awareness to more people of the injustice that exists, the white privilege that most of us possess, and the need for change. More Squared is going through a reckoning, both internally and externally. We do not want to be seen as the white social justice folks, the do-gooders. And we're going through a transformation of leadership and a rededication to be fervently anti-racist in both public advocacy, our actions, and all internal practices, committing to racial equity and dismantling systems that have maintained inequitable outcomes for communities of color through omission and commission. We are committed to investing in each other by building authentic relationships to realize transformational change regarding racial injustice. You might have seen More Squared in the news lately, a lot. We've been working for local police control for Kansas City, Missouri, for replacement of police chiefs who refuse to hold officers accountable for killings of unarmed citizens like Donnie Sanders and Cameron Lamb and John Albers. On May 11th, I was so proud to be part of a protest alongside at least 6 other All Souls members outside of the police commissioners meeting, bringing to light the need for local control and justice for Terrence Bridges and others who have been killed by police officers with impunity. More Squared is also continuing to work for Medicaid expansion and funding in Missouri and Kansas. And my passion, immigration reform. Nationally, More Squared is participating in advocacy to pass the Citizenship Act of 2021 to put the millions of undocumented essential workers on a path to citizenship. The anniversaries of the killing of George Floyd and the burning of Black Wall Street remind us that this work is vital. Damon Lindelof, the creator of the Watchmen series about the Tulsa riots, said, "The fires that destroyed Black Wall Street still burn today. The only way to put out the fires is if we fight them together." If you want to be a part of the healing of this nation, working towards real change in this nation's caste system, putting out the fires of Black oppression, moving towards economic equity, please support the work of More Squared today with your generous donation in the offering, or by making a monthly donation through the More Squared website, more2.org, and through your actions by joining our work as firefighters. Thank you for your support.
Let's say together the words of dedication for our offering. We dedicate our offerings and our actions to the mission at the heart of this congregation, to build a respectful, caring community, to inspire personal and spiritual growth, and to create change toward a just and compassionate society.
From the Other America, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., 1967. I need not remind you that poverty, the gaps in our society, the gulfs between inordinate superfluous wealth and abject deadening poverty have brought about a great deal of despair, a great deal of tension, a great deal of bitterness. We have seen this bitterness expressed over the last few summers in the violent explosions in our cities. Certain conditions continue to exist in our society, which must be condemned as vigorously as we condemn riots. In the final analysis, a riot is the language of the unheard. And what is it that America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last few years. It has failed to hear that the promises of freedom and justice have not been met. And it has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice, equality, and humanity. And so, in a real sense, our nation's summers of riots are caused by our nation's winters of delay. As long as America postpones justice, we stand in the position of having these recurrences of violence and riots over and over again. Social justice and progress are the absolute guarantors of riot prevention.
From the second inaugural address by Abraham Lincoln. It may seem strange that any men should dare to ask for a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. But let us judge not, that we be not judged. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. The Almighty has his own purposes. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which, in the providence of God, must needs come, but which, having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war as the woe due to those by whom the offense came. Shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him? Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet, if God wills that it continue, until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether.
No more auction block for me. No more, no more, no more auction block for me. Many thousand gone. No more driver's lash for me. No more, no more, No more driver's lash for me, many thousand gone. No more peck of corn for me, no more, no more, no more peck of corn for me, many thousand gone. No more pint of salt for me, no more, no more, no more pint of salt for me, many thousand gone, many thousand gone.
Most people have heard of the slightly eccentric American architect Frank Lloyd Wright. Many of us realize that he was a practicing Unitarian who designed several of our now historic churches. But you have to be something of a history buff to realize that Frank was also the nephew of the renowned Unitarian humanist minister and activist Jenkins Lloyd Jones, who served as secretary of the Western Unitarian Conference and helped to found churches throughout the Midwest. Very rare indeed is the scholar who is aware of the career of Frank's cousin, Jenkins' son, Richard Lloyd Jones. As a preacher's kid, Richard grew up watching his father sacrifice his health and family life, as well as his peace of mind, for the sake of ministry and radical social political idealism. In a not uncommon reaction to this experience, Richard became a defender of conventional views, determined to achieve his own financial security. By the time he was in his 40s, Richard found himself in deep conflict with his father's profoundly pacifist opposition to American involvement in the First World War. Having served and been wounded in the carnage of America's Civil War, Jenkins would consider no justification for any form of military violence. His son Richard saw a German war machine threatening not just U.S. national interests, but the future of civilization. In December of 1919, Richard purchased the Tulsa Democrat newspaper, renamed it the Tulsa Tribune, and moved his family from Wisconsin to the booming new oil town in Oklahoma. A couple of months later, in the spring of 1920, he ran an advertisement in his paper, inviting any liberal religious citizens of Tulsa to a meeting in his home. This group would become the core founders of the All Souls Unitarian Church of Tulsa. Richard Jones would be an early, consistent, and generous supporter. Not for nothing had he observed his father trying to assist fledgling congregations to survive financially. Today, as some of you know, the Tulsa All Souls Church is one of the 2 or 3 largest UU congregations in the world. More than that, Richard remained an influential lay leader for decades. He would go on to serve as vice president of the National American Unitarian Association during the next war years, from 1942 to 44. He was also a leading prison reform advocate. However, we should consider carefully before we extol Richard Lloyd Jones as an exemplary turn-of-the-century Unitarian. His reforming impulses also led him to approve of prohibition, oppose immigration, and support the activities of the resurgent Ku Klux Klan, and later the activities of Senator Joseph McCarthy in his newspaper. The Tulsa Tribune was to the city of that day much of what Facebook and Twitter are to our present culture. It offered people information and opinion, as well as excitement and connection, memory and advice, and notice of opportunities for cultural, social, and political activities. The Tulsa of the early 20th century was a significantly segregated city. Except to work as domestics or laborers, the grandchildren of former slaves were expected to confine themselves to the Greenwood district, a neighborhood centered on the intersection of Greenwood and Archer Streets, just to the north of the Frisco Railroad yards. Although settled in the 1890s as part of the Oklahoma land rush and Indian removal, Tulsa did not carry the heavy history of the slave state South, and many Black people flocked there, soon attracted by well-paid jobs in the oil fields and hoping to escape the hostility of Jim Crow Southern plantation society. Several visionary Black entrepreneurs assembled property and built hotels, restaurants, churches, and businesses, as well as homes for the expanding Black community. Schools, libraries, and a hospital followed in short order. By the 20s, there were Black-run banks, newspapers, theaters, Masonic lodges, funeral homes, and everything else needed for a self-contained, prosperous, full-service urban center that was owned, staffed, and patronized exclusively by people of color, some of whom accumulated significant wealth. A generation of men from Greenwood served in the armed forces and saw combat during the First World War that Richard Lloyd Jones felt so strongly about. They came home with their rifles and notions about equality and self-defense. The Greenwood district, which had been referred to by white Tulsans as Little Africa, became known around the country as Black or Negro Wall Street. This visible affluence did not sit well with the white political power structure in Tulsa. As Greenwood continued to prosper, it sought to grow, putting pressure on the designated white neighborhoods adjacent to it. The center of town rail yards, once an undesirable location, began to look like an ideal place for an elegant, state-of-the-art train depot to adorn the city's cultural landscape, if only it were not surrounded by Black people. At the end of Richard Lloyd Jones's first summer in Tulsa, on the last weekend in August 1920, 2 completed lynchings out of some 60 in the U.S. that year occurred nearby. In Tulsa, a white drifter named Roy Bolton, accused of fatally shooting a white taxi driver, Homer Nida, was taken from the Tulsa County Jail on August 28th and hanged from a sign. This incident led to the defeat that fall of Sheriff James Woolley's reelection and further undermined the city's already shaky confidence in Tulsa law enforcement. Tulsa Police Chief John Gustafson, acknowledging that his men did nothing to stop the murder, said, "In my honest opinion, the lynching of Belton will prove of real benefit to Tulsa and vicinity." The next day, Claude Chandler, a Black moonshiner accused of killing 2 lawmen and wounding a third, was taken from the Oklahoma County Jail. He was found the next morning hanging from a tree with 2 bullets in his head. Editor A.J. Smitherman of the Black-owned Tulsa Star chided Oklahoma City's African Americans for not protecting Chandler by force if necessary. "No man or set of men have any right to conspire and arm themselves to desecrate the law. But any man or set of men may rightfully and legally take up arms to defend and uphold the law, Smitherman told his readers. It was a message that the residents of Greenwood took to heart. By the following spring, Richard Lloyd-Jones was warning the mayor and police chief on his editorial page that the people of Tulsa are becoming awake to conditions that are no longer tolerable. If crime and corruption in the city were not cleaned up, and cleaned up quickly, he announced, an awakened community conscience will do it for them. This community conscience was not embodied in the compromised police force, but in vigilante organizations like the American Protective League and the Ku Klux Klan. What exactly was the nature of the intolerable vice and corruption? According to Jones, it was ideas about racial equality being spread by the likes of the NAACP. The booming neighborhood of Greenwood fostered pernicious notions about social mobility and equal rights. On May 15th of that year, the Tribune ran a small item on a black man named Gilbert Irgi, who was arrested for riding a white streetcar in Tulsa. The black man thought he owned the car, ran the headline. Another front page story a week later made the case against racial equality more explicit. An ad hoc commission made up of a white pastor, former judge, and private detective reported on their undercover adventures in Greenwood to the Tulsa Tribune readers. Despite prohibition, liquor was available at every hotel and rooming house they visited. At hotels, black porters offered to connect the men to prostitutes, some of them white women. The committee visited a roadhouse where they found whites and Negroes singing and dancing together. A subversive new kind of music, jazz, filled the air. Young white girls were dancing while Negroes played the piano. The prospect of racial equality was itself enough of a threat. But throw in the element of white girls enjoying themselves in the company of newly wealthy black men, abetted by jazz and liquor, and the Tribune had the city's attention. The situation was indeed intolerable. On the morning of June 1st, 1921, coordinated action unfolded. The previous afternoon, Jones's paper had run an inflammatory front page story about the arrest of a 19-year-old black man at the behest of a young white woman who was alarmed by his touching her in the elevator she was operating. Legend has it that he tripped and either stepped on her foot or grabbed her arm, but she let out a yell, and that was enough to set the preparations in motion. Legend also has it that along with the news story characterizing this incident as an assault, which both of the participants later denied, the Tribune also published that afternoon an editorial suggesting that another lynching was expected in response. If such an editorial was published, it survives only in folk memory. All trace of it has been removed from the newspaper's archives, and despite the offer of a generous reward, no copy can currently be found. If it was printed, it appears to have been only in the downtown early edition, but Richard Lloyd-Jones would certainly have been the author. By the evening of May 31st, an armed white crowd had begun to surround the county jail where Dick Rowland was being held. Several contingents of black veterans with their army rifles took editor Smitherman's advice, formed up in Greenwood, marched to the courthouse where the jail was located, and offered their services to the newly elected sheriff. Mindful of his predecessor's fate and hoping to forestall violence, he told them to go home. As the sheriff tried to disperse the last group, a white man in the crowd grabbed one of the black volunteers' gun, informing him with a racial epithet that he had no business to have it, and a shot was fired. A chaotic gun battle ensued, during which the Greenwood volunteers fled back across the rail tracks to their own neighborhood and attempted to set up a perimeter around the district. With the help of other residents, they defended it successfully overnight, but white attackers hurled burning oil-soaked rags into the nearest buildings, setting them afire. Some combination of white rioters and white police officers prevented fire department equipment from getting near the conflagrations, and they spread easily. Reviewing the photographs and accounts, career firefighter, now State Senator Kevin Matthews, concludes the fire department was held back by the local officials at that time. We weren't protected by the police. It disappoints me that the government would support this kind of tragedy. By the morning of June 1st, all the prior arrangements were in full operation and the obliteration of Greenwood was underway. While the sheriff continued to defend Dick Rowland, who was later cleared of all charges, released, and moved on to the West Coast, the police chief deputized 200 white citizens who overwhelmed the defenders and moved systematically through the Black District, looting and burning businesses and homes, and marching more than 6,000 Black citizens at gunpoint to one of 3 internment areas outside of Greenwood, including Convention Hall and the Tulsa County Fairgrounds. One of the stranger aspects of the morning was the appearance of several privately owned aircraft from Curtis Southwest Field outside of Tulsa. Accounts differ as to whether law enforcement officers were aboard the planes, whether guns were used to strafe Blacks from the air, or whether containers of turpentine were dropped from them to accelerate the arson from the upper floors of buildings. But no one denies that the aircraft, operated by white pilots, were present. The governor ordered the Oklahoma National Guard to help put down the Negro uprising, and the Adjutant General Charles Barrett arrived by special train at about 9:15 a.m. with 109 troops from Oklahoma City. After summoning reinforcements from several other Oklahoma cities and advising the mayor, sheriff, and police chief of his presence, Barrett declared martial law at 11:49 a.m., and by noon, the troops had managed to suppress most of the remaining violence. They then assisted in escorting remaining Blacks out of the area to detention sites, where many of them were kept for the next several days. In the end, 191 businesses, a junior high school, several churches, and the only hospital in the district had been destroyed. 1,256 houses were burned and another 215 were looted but not burned. The Tulsa Real Estate Exchange estimated property losses amounted to a total of $32 million in 2019 dollars. This was wealth that was vaporized in the Black community. Official Tulsa city records were careful to call the events of May 31st and June 1st a riot, because that allowed insurance companies to deny claims for losses and damages incurred by the residents of Greenwood. No Black person received any financial compensation or insurance reimbursement for their destroyed property or personal injuries, although several white property owners did. White Tulsans would build family legacy fortunes from the oil boom of the teens and 20s. Despite determined efforts to rebuild some aspects of the Black Wall Street, the scale of Greenwood's previous prosperity could not be recovered. It would take over 6 months for owners of the burned properties to begin receiving building permits to reconstruct their homes or businesses. And many of those who tried to do so spent the following winter living in a tent city while they struggled to rebuild. Meanwhile, much of what was known as the burned area was rezoned for industrial use by codes that made it illegal to construct houses or businesses on the site of structures that had previously burned. Less than 2 years later, the city broke ground for its long-desired elaborate Union Depot rail hub located on property that had once been Greenwood. Richard Lloyd Jones, the apostle of Unitarianism in Tulsa, rejoiced at the destruction of this community. In the June 4th edition of the Tribune, he wrote this, with the blasé use of a word no longer pronounced in polite society. Such a district as the old N town must never be allowed in Tulsa again. It was a cesspool of iniquity and corruption. In this old N town, there were a lot of bad N's, and a bad N is the lowest thing that walks on 2 feet. Give a bad N his booze and his dope and a gun, and he thinks he can shoot up the world. And all these things were to be found in N town: booze, dope, bad N's, and guns. It is worth noting that the presses of the 2 Black-owned newspapers were among the properties destroyed, and Smitherman's Tulsa Star never resumed publication. Although Jones had no regret to waste on the neighborhood that he considered so iniquitous, he was quick to join in representing to the rest of the nation that Tulsa had an immediate plan for the benefit of its displaced Black community. The Chamber of Commerce, City Hall, and other local organizations loudly affirmed in public and in print that Tulsans could take care of their own, and that any offers of fundraising or financial assistance from elsewhere would be received as an insulting implication that local resources were inadequate, or that anything might be owed to the Black community whose devastation was understood to be both necessary and its own fault. As you may have heard over this past week, the 100th anniversary observances of the destruction of Greenwood have been replete with conflict. William Faulkner's observation is once again proved true. The past is never dead, it's not even past. If the case for reparations makes specific, calculatable sense anywhere, it certainly does in Tulsa, where unpaid insurance claims and city compensation to living survivors and their identifiable heirs could be readily determined. I'm thinking there is another sermon here, perhaps on this date in 2022, when current issues have had time to play themselves out somewhat. But there is one more thought that I invite us all to conjure with over the coming year, and whenever our dominant culture sensibilities are shocked by the violence, destruction, and looting that so often accompanies our own era's protests against the slow-motion massacre of Black men today. It is Lincoln's words that I hear. Not, you will notice, asserting his own ideological or theological position, but turning the pious audience's faith back upon itself. If God wills that this mighty scourge of war continue until all the wealth piled up by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. How many Target stores and AutoZones would it take to add up to what was lost in Greenwood? And then we could start to talk about Rosewood, Florida, 2 years later. After that, we could talk about the Freedmen's Bank decades before. And then. All Souls Unitarian Universalist Church in Tulsa, Oklahoma, would not stand today as a proud beacon of free thought and progressive conscience if Richard Lloyd Jones had not brought his father's legacy to the new oil city on the prairie. And Greenwood District, the nation's Black Wall Street, might have launched a generational legacy of Black prosperity and growing power if he had not leveraged his media access to help bring that thriving community down in flames. This is the heritage we carry as Unitarian Universalists, as heirs of the European colonial adventure and of the peoples harmed in that history of dominance. We cannot undo the past, but we can break the silence and tell the story. We can confess the ambiguities of the human heart, even our own. We can choose the difficult task of literally digging up the bones that lie buried in our own complicity, so that the truth might at last be told, and our heroes stripped of their false valor. The existence of Greenwood was and remains a refutation and a rebuke to the white imagination, which for so many centuries could not bring itself to envision a creative, competent, self-sustaining, and happy Black community investing in its own future, sharing among its members, and enjoying the rewards of that investment. If we of the present day are to do better than our predecessors, I think we must begin with that radical and subversive vision of Black people rooted in a place of safety, happiness, success, and self-determination. If we are to believe in that freedom, we must know what the story of Greenwood proves is possible and why it continues to matter so profoundly even after 100 years. Memory and promise, it's what we do. It is sacred work. Let's sing.
We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest
until the killing of Black men, Black mothers' sons, is as important as the killing of white men, white mothers' sons. That which touches me most is that I had the chance to work with people, passing on to others that which was passed on to me. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes.
To me, young people come first. They have the courage where we fail. And if I can but shed some light as they carry us through the gale, the older I get, the better I know that the secret of my going on is when the reins are in the hands of the young who dare to run against the storm.
We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until
Not needing to clutch for power, not needing the light to just shine on me. I need to be one in the number as we stand against tyranny. Struggling myself don't mean a whole lot. I've come to realize that teaching others to stand up and fight is the only way our struggle survives. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes.
I'm a woman who speaks in a voice, and I must be heard. Sometimes I can be quite difficult, bound to no man's word. We who believe in freedom cannot rest.
We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it rests.
The words of the mid-century advocate for racial and social justice, Reverend A. Powell Davies. Holy wisdom, from whom we seek concealment of our treason and shelter for our lies, teach us that conscience makes no compromise and why it cannot. Teach us that the truth we banish leaves us empty of all meaning, and that the good we would not love returns to break our hearts. How often have we turned away from what was calling to us, imploring God to save us from the need to do God's will of true justice? We have craved protection. We wanted to be sheltered from reality. O thou to whom we prayed for shelter and there was none, teach us now to pray a braver prayer.
We are building a new way. We are building a new way. We are building a new way, feeling stronger every day. We are building a new way. We are working to be free. We are working to be free. We are working to be free. Hate and greed and jealousy. We are building a new way. We can feed our every need. We can feed our every need. We can feed our every need. Start with love, that is the seed. We are building a new way. Peace and freedom
Peace and freedom is our cry. Without these, our people die. We are building a new age.
We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fires of commitment. For all these we carry in our minds and hearts, until the time shall come when we will be together again. Thank you for being with us. We hope that your conscience has been stirred and your spirit touched on this Memorial Day morning. We invite you to join in a time of fellowship and informal conversation at the All Souls Community Connection Zoom room. That link can be found here in the chat or on our website homepage. Don't forget to sign up for the All Souls Home Gardens tour next week and register to attend the National General Assembly at the end of June. We hope that you will plan to be present next Sunday to help us celebrate the high school graduation of Zach Brennan, as well as all the teachers and young people in our religious education program. Until then, please, everyone, support your local vaccination efforts. Take care, stay safe, and be well this week.